when they crucified my Lord. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And were you there when they nailed him to that tree? Were you there when they nailed him to that tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to that tree? And were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross, so despised by the world, has a wondrous attraction for me. For the dear Lamb of God left his glory above to bear it to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. To the old rugged cross I will ever be true. Its shame and reproach gladly bear, and he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. Oh, that old rugged cross. Oh, that old rugged cross. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross until my trophies at last I lay down. And I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross.
Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. Then their whole assembly rose up and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "You say so." Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no grounds for charging this man." But they kept insisting, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he started, even to here." When Pilate heard this, he asked if the man was a Galilean. Finding that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem during those days. Herod was very glad to see Jesus. For a long time he had wanted to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some miracle performed by him. So he kept asking him questions, but Jesus did not answer him. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt, mocked him, dressed him in bright clothing, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Previously, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You have brought me this man as one who misleads the people. But in fact, after examining him in your presence, I have found no grounds to charge this man with these things that you accuse him of. Neither has Herod, because he sent him back to us. Clearly he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will have him whipped and then release him." Then they all cried out together, "Take this man away. Release Barabbas to us." He had been thrown into prison for a rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What has this man done wrong? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him whipped and then release him." But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand and release the one they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for rebellion and murder. But he handed Jesus over to their will. As they led him away, they seized Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming in from the country, and laid the cross on him to carry behind Jesus. A large crowd of people followed him, including women who were mourning and lamenting him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Look, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the women without children, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. And when they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on the right, one on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they are doing." And they divided his clothes and cast lots. The people stood watching, and even the leaders were scoffing. "He saved others. Let him save himself if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came offering him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." An inscription was above him, "This is the King of the Jews." Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, "Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are being punished justly because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light failed. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle, and Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." Saying this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what happened, he began to glorify God, saying, "This man really was righteous." All the crowds that had gathered for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, went home striking their chests. But all who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. 2,000 years ago tonight, the sun was setting on the darkest day in human history. This day actually began the night before, when Jesus was betrayed by one of his 12 disciples named Judas, and he was arrested by Roman soldiers, and he was mocked, and he was beaten, and then he was thrown into the complete darkness of a pit. And then when the sun rose on Friday morning, Jesus was pulled out of that pit. He was put through the mockery of a trial before the Sanhedrin, which were Jewish religious leaders. He was interrogated by Pilate. He was put on public display. He was rejected by the very people that just a few days earlier wanted to crown him as their king. And then he was beaten within an inch of his life. And you know, as I read this passage, I couldn't help but think about all of the events and just the noise that was filling the air that day. All of the noise that was surrounded by the events in Jesus' life that day. Noise of false accusations, as the Sanhedrin were literally shouting these false accusations against him. The noise of the roar of the mob demanding the release of Barabbas, who was a convicted murderer. I think about the noise of the screams of the crowd screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" I think about all the noise that followed that, with the mockery and the blasphemy of the soldiers and the crowds and the Pharisees as they walked by his cross that day, as Jesus is hanging there, and they're wagging their heads and they're spitting on him and they're cursing him. And I think about the noise that was filling Jesus' ears as he was dying, and these criminals who were being crucified with him, they are mocking him. And then I think about the screams of agony. Crucifixion was brutal. It was torture. It was the worst form of execution. And I cannot imagine the blood-curdling, almost inhuman screams coming from Jesus as the flesh is being ripped off of his body, as he's having spikes driven through his wrists and through his feet, as he's suffocating. Jesus died a death of suffocation. I can't imagine the screams. And then everything went dark. Everything went dark because Luke tells us there in that passage that the sun quit shining. And then something else happened. It wasn't just the noise of the crowds, the criminals, or the Pharisees, but in that moment, creation itself began to cry out. Creation itself began to scream. The Bible tells us that there was an earthquake in that moment. And as chaos began to ensue, as the temple veil was being ripped, as buildings were literally being shaken off of their foundation, and John tells us that the tombs gave up their dead. People were literally rising from the dead in this moment. Can you imagine the screams of horror in the streets of Jerusalem? And men and women, it says there in the text, that they were beating their chest and ripping their clothes. All chaos was breaking out as creation itself was screaming. And then, in musical terms, kind of like a crescendo, the Son of God, the creator of the universe, cried out one final time. And he breathed his last. And there, in the darkness, the light of the world was snuffed out. And as the sun set, just like it is tonight, 2,000 years ago, and Joseph of Arimathea and the women that followed Jesus as they were hurrying to prepare Jesus' body for burial, it looked like the darkness was here to stay. As the disciples and the followers of Jesus entered that longest night, they were sheltered in place. That should sound kind of familiar to us. The disciples were hiding, sheltering in place in their homes, fearing for their very lives. Can you imagine the deafening silence that must have filled their homes and their hearts. Can you imagine how they must have felt that night? Their leader, their best friend, hey, they had just watched him be executed and suffocate and die. You know, we here in 2020, we have the advantage of knowing the full story. We have the advantage of having John, one of Jesus' closest friends. We have his words that he wrote several years after this event. In John chapter 1, where it says that the light, John says that the light came into the darkness and the darkness cannot overcome the light. We have that now, but that night, 2,000 years ago, they thought that the darkness had overcome the light. The light of the world was gone, and it seemed like darkness had won. You know, just this week, the Surgeon General for the United States of America said in a press conference, and I quote, "This is going to be the saddest week in America since 9/11. That's scary. And I thought, how appropriate that this man would say that this week would be the saddest week in America since 9/11. Because this night was the saddest night in human history. You think about one of the things that they're talking about, and my family, we live in a subdivision, and right at the entrance of the subdivision there's a funeral home. And yesterday I was driving by, and they were preparing for a funeral, and there was just a handful of chairs, and they were spaced out several feet apart, and there was only maybe 5, 6, less than 10 people. I read a story just this week about a woman whose husband died from COVID-19, and she had to tell him goodbye over FaceTime. She couldn't even be there when her husband died. These people that I saw yesterday, they couldn't even be there when they lowered their friend and their family member into the ground. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus' disciples, they were sheltered in place. They couldn't even be there when he died. They couldn't even be there when they laid him in the tomb. We sang just a few moments ago, "Were you there?" There was nobody there, just a couple of people, and they had to leave in a hurry. That just teaches me that Jesus knows what we're going through. And he died to begin to fix that. You know, tonight is the sunset. And 2,000 years ago, the sun set. But there's a sunrise coming. There's a sunrise coming. And at sunset, when hope had died, when the darkness looked like it had overcome the light, the sun was going to rise in a couple of days. And with the sunrise, something new was coming. I want to challenge you tomorrow, as you're sheltering in place, put yourself in the disciples' shoes. As you go to bed tonight, entering into the longest night, I want you to think about identifying with these followers of Jesus who in a moment lost hope. Darkness looked like it had won as the sun set that day 2,000 years ago.